Well, welcome back from the break. I guess in reality, it's welcome back to another day because I'm recording this on another day from the day that I recorded the first section of this. But welcome back from the break nonetheless. Let's take a look at the concept check question that we finished with at the end of the last section, and then move on to talk about terrestrial tetrapods, or the remainder of the terrestrial tetrapods, let's put it that way. So many amphibians live as adults in dry terrestrial environments, while others never transition to dry land, continuing as fully aquatic adults. What adaptations permit these two lifestyles? Well, those that remain fully aquatic show pedomorphosis. So they retain the juvenile characteristics of the feather-like gills around the neck, the flattened fish-like tail, and other adaptations that allow them to remain fully aquatic, and they spend their adult life in water. Those that transition to dry land obviously lose their gills and develop the ability to buccal breathe to carry out gas exchange through their lungs. They also do gas exchange through their skin. In order to avoid drying out, because their skin does not prevent drying out, it has no protective layer on it, they'll burrow, they'll hide in the leaf litter, they'll live in moist environments, and of course they can also utilize water for reproduction, which is typical of amphibians, but those that are more terrestrial tend to have some other ways of reproducing. So some of them produce a foamy mass that forms a hardened coat around the fertilized eggs to prevent them from drying out and allow the young to develop in there. Others do reproduction, for instance, in epiphytic bromeliads that are growing in trees. They have little pools of water captured in the tops of the leaves. And there are frogs, for instance, that utilize that as their breeding habitat and lay the eggs in there. And some frogs and toads actually practice viviparity. And you may recall from when we were talking about sharks that viviparous means that the eggs, the fertilized eggs, retained within the body of the female. In the case of some frogs and toads, in fact, the eggs are underneath the skin on the back of the adults, and this and that's where the larval, the form of the frogs and toads, the tadpoles, actually develop and emerge as fully functional frogs and toads on the small scale and grow from there, having carried out the first part of their life embedded within the skin of one of their parents. And so there are a number of different ways for amphibians to utilize dry land and to adapt to the necessity to remain moist and to carry out their reproduction in a moist environment, even though they have no way of providing I'm trying to think of what the right word to use here, a formal protective layer that allows the development to occur independently of the adults. They have to provide some sort of quote unquote parental care in some fashion, or utilize very unique features of the environment in order to allow the development to still take place in water. That is the big issue for amphibians. They are tied to water in order to be able to reproduce in some fashion. Yes, they have some adaptations to allow them to get a little bit around that, but that still comes down to maintaining the moisture of their bodies and surviving in a relatively moist environment. But we are about to see all of that change, because to be truly successful in a dry terrestrial environment, you need to break the link to bodies of water. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to break the link to development in an aquatic-like environment. And in fact, that is not what happens. But we need to break the link to having to return to bodies of water for reproduction as a general rule, which we see in amphibians. And this leads to the development of the amniotic egg as the means of getting around this link to water for reproduction. The fact that the egg is now capable of creating its own, or the developing embryo, let's put it that way, creating its own internal moist environment in the form of the amniotic sac and the amniotic fluid that allows the embryo to develop inside a fluid-filled container that can in turn be encased in some form of protective layer, either a leathery shell, a calcium carbonate reinforced shell, or in the case of mammals, placental mammals at least, retained within the body of the female. But still, the embryo completes its development within the amniotic fluid contained inside the amniotic sac. So the evolution of the amniote condition represents a major step in the successful colonization of land by animals in the form of terrestrial tetrapods. So this is the phylogenetic tree that is currently accepted for all of the terrestrial tetrapods. And so you can see that there are two major branches of terrestrial tetrapods. The synapsids that, through an intermediate group called the cynodonts, evolve into mammals, and then the diapsids, which represent all the other terrestrial tetrapods, the snakes, the lizards, the extinct reptiles in the form of the dinosaurs, and the pterosaurs, the mosasaurs, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, all of those classic reptilian creatures that we think of from the age of the dinosaurs that cohabited the planet during the age of the dinosaurs. And then, of course, all of those that are extant today, so the turtles, the crocodilians, birds, because yes, birds are reptiles, they are dinosaurs in every sense of the word, and then the lizards and the snakes. So these are the two big branches of terrestrial tetrapods, the amniotes, that have successfully colonized dry land because of the amniotic egg. So let's first talk about the features of the amniotes as a group, and then we'll talk about the reptiles first, and then we'll talk about the mammals second. We'll progress all the way through to primates, and then we'll take another break, and then we'll come back and we'll take a look at human evolution. And there may be another break along the way there. I think I've forgotten another break in there somewhere. But let's take a look at the derived features of amniotes. So the first thing to remember is that the major derived feature is the amniotic egg. And you should recall from chapter 47 and our discussion of embryological development that within the embryonic or the amniotic egg, you have these extra embryonic membranes. I'm getting a little bit tongue-tied, I think. So you should remember the four membranes, the chorion, which is the one that is most external to the whole mass. It contains the whole embryonic mass. It's often involved in gas exchange. And certainly within the shelled egg, it is definitely involved in gas exchange. That may seem like a contradiction in that the shell is there to stop everything from drying out, but it turns out that the shell is actually gas permeable. So it allows oxygen in and carbon dioxide out, which is good because there needs to be gas exchange. But the chorion is the membrane that actually carries out the gas exchange, secretes or releases carbon dioxide into the space inside the shell and takes up oxygen and transports it to the embryo via the circulatory system that develops in parallel with the chorion. Then you have the allantois, which is for disposal of nitrogenous waste, because you should recall that nitrogenous waste is toxic. That's the reason why we as mammals have kidneys to filter out the nitrogenous waste from our bloodstream and excrete it through the urine. You can't do that if you're inside a shelled egg. So you need a location to store the nitrogenous waste. The allantois serves that purpose. Then we have the yolk sac, which surrounds the yolk material and releases enzymes that break down the nutrients in the yolk to mobilize them into the circulatory system that develops within the yolk in conjunction with the yolk sac to transport nutrients to the embryo and provide the nutrition for the embryonic development within the egg. And then there is the bespoke membrane, the amnion, which surrounds the amniotic sac or forms the amniotic sac, contains the amniotic fluid. And this is the one that is most closely related to the embryo because it surrounds and contains the amniotic fluid that the embryo is immersed in. And irrespective of whether you are a reptile laying a leathery bound shelled egg or a bird laying a calcium carbonate reinforced shelled egg, or a placental mammal where you retain the egg within the body of the female and development takes place within the uterus and support is via the placenta, you still see these extra embryonic membranes playing an important role in supporting the development of the embryo, particularly the amniotic sac, because all embryos complete their early development in this liquid environment as I guess, connection back to the origin of all life in an aquatic environment in an ocean, and the observation that all early development takes place in an aquatic environment or a miniature ocean, because amniotic fluid is quite salty, which is in keeping with it being a miniature version of the ocean. But there are other adaptations that amniotes also show. So one of the things that goes hand in hand with being able to reproduce in the absence of large bodies of water or without a connection to a large body of water is the ability to retain moisture within the skin. And so the skin becomes moisture tight. So in the case of reptiles and birds, it's more of a leathery-like skin with scales on the outside. In the case of mammals, it's not as distinctly rough, but you do have embedded within the skin glands to regulate the loss of fluid to allow for body cooling, the sweat glands, but it is still a moisture-tight barrier, and the glands allow you to regulate water loss. And then in terms of breathing, and this is something that you see in all terrestrial tetrapods, the rib cage has musculature attached to it. We call them and the name has left me. I'll have to get back to you on the name. I'll probably think of it at some point. But the rib cage has muscles attached to it that allows the rib cage to expand and contract. So in reptiles and birds, you see this. They can expand and contract their rib cage using the rib muscles. And the reason why that's necessary is because lungs have no ability to expand and contract on their own. They're kind of a very fancy paper bag. And so the only way that you can inflate the lungs and deflate the lungs to allow gas exchange is by expanding and contracting the body cavity or by forcing air into the lungs. So buccal breathing seen in amphibians forces the air into the lungs to expand the lungs, and then they simply collapse again to force the air out. But in reptiles, the rib cage now expands to expand the body cavity and therefore expand the lungs. And so you can regulate the breathing, and you can see the reptile rib cage expanding and collapsing. Mammals have an added layer of muscle at the base of the body cavity. We refer to it as the diaphragm, that can contract and relax to also aid in the expansion of the body cavity. And this allows mammals to breathe even more efficiently and more effectively than reptiles. And so the presence of that extra layer of muscle at the base of the body cavity, at the posterior end of the body cavity, the diaphragm, allows mammals to be even more effective at breathing on dry land. So these are other adaptations that you see associated with terrestrial tetrapods. So when we start looking for the very earliest of the amniotes, we need to go back to around 370 million years ago, when the early amniotes start to branch away from a common ancestor with amphibians. This is a time period when the continental land masses are starting to slowly but surely come together. The process would not be completed until around 260 million years ago, around the end of the Permian, but this slow and progressive coming together of the continental land masses would actually favor the evolution of amniotes for two reasons. Number one, the movement of the continental land masses would disrupt the normal patterns of ocean currents, which would change the weather patterns on the planet and would start to cause the land masses to dry out. At the same time, as they come together and eventually form the very large supercontinent known as Pangaea, it limits the amount of coastline that's available and limits the amount of large bodies of fresh water inland, rivers and streams and so forth, because the rain patterns start to change, the interiors of the continental land masses start to dry out, and as they come together, the interior of the very large unified landmass starts to dry out even more. And this all points in the direction of favoring those organisms that can survive and reproduce in the absence of water. And the amniotes are in a perfect position to do so because of the amniotic egg, and particularly the shelled egg, which is the early form of the amniotic condition, and the development of water impermeable skins that allow them to survive without drying out on a drying out landmass. And so as this process starts to begin, we start to see the slow evolution of the amniote condition. So when we start looking at the two clades of amniotes, the synapsids and the diapsids, the vast majority of terrestrial tetrapods extant today, and also the vast majority of terrestrial tetrapods represented in the fossil record, belong to the diapsid branch that evolves into those organisms that we refer to as dinosaurs, as reptiles. The dinosaurs being the most famous of the group, I guess, from the fossil record. But we'd also need to remember that the reptilian clade is quite diverse. It includes all of those things that we traditionally think of as reptiles, like the lizards and the snakes, the turtles and the crocodilians, but also includes dinosaurs and the other reptiles that dominated the Mesozoic, the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, and the ichthyosaurs in the oceans and large freshwater bodies, the pteranodons and tyrannosaurs that are the flying lizards, and of course, evolving from one lineage of dinosaurs, the birds, the modern day dinosaurs that are still with us. So as much as we think that, again, dinosaurs became extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, we can no longer actually say that. What we need to say is that the non-avian, the non-bird dinosaurs became extinct, but one line of dinosaurs represented by the birds is still around with us today. So the advantages of reptiles over amphibians is the shelled egg, obviously, and the waterproof barrier formed out of scales that are formed from the protein keratin. Now, keratin is going to play a very important role throughout our discussion of terrestrial tetrapods, because keratin is not a single protein. It is a family of proteins, and keratin has turned out to be quite useful in creating structures that are associated with the terrestrial tetrapod clade. So scales on reptiles are made out of keratin. Feathers on birds are made out of keratin. Hair on mammals is made out of keratin. Claws, nails, beaks are all made out of keratin. There is a large family of keratin proteins, and they are put to use in different ways. And so keratin, as a product of the amniotes, as a protein associated with amniotes, turns out to be incredibly important as well. We do know, of course, this is something that is not unknown. Most people are aware of this, that reptiles are ectothermic, meaning that they obtain their body heat from their environment. So most people would use the term cold-blooded. They're not actually cold-blooded. They will heat their body temperature up to around our temperature in order to be very mobile and to be able to carry out a very active life activity. The only issue for them is that they don't use their metabolism to generate that heat energy. They have to take it from their environment, which is the reason why reptiles in the morning tend to be very sluggish until they can warm their body up in the sun. But you also see them moving in and out of the sun as they warm their body up, and then they need to cool it down again because they do not have the ability to shed excess heat. They don't have sweat glands. So whereas mammals can shed some of the excess heat energy by sweating, reptiles simply can't do that. Neither can birds. So they run the risk of overheating as a consequence. One of the things that we do recognize about birds, all modern birds at least, are all endothermic. That is, they do maintain a higher than environmental body temperature through the use of their metabolism. And in fact, their internal body temperature is around 101 degrees Fahrenheit compared to our own internal body temperature of around 98 to 99 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're a little bit warmer in terms of their overall body temperature. What is interesting about that is the simple observation that birds are dinosaurs. And what that suggests is that because birds are endothermic, there is the very real potential that some of the dinosaurs that are related to birds, which includes, by the way, dinosaurs like T-Rex and the allosaurs, large meat-eating bipedal dinosaurs, and the large herbivorous dinosaurs, there may actually be a case to be made that some of those were themselves endothermic. And one of the things that points to that possibility is the rate of growth of some of the young of some of these dinosaurs. Because if you are endothermic, you have a high metabolism, you have a lot of energy available, and therefore the young can grow relatively quickly. And you can see that growth reflected in rings within the bones, just like tree rings. And it turns out that a number of these large and small bipedal meat-eating dinosaurs had very rapid growth as juveniles, which hints at the possibility that either they were truly endothermic, like their bird relatives, or they had some way of maintaining an internally high body temperature relative to the environment by some other as yet unknown mechanism. There are some ways that it can be done. Some of the larger predatory fish actually have some fast twitch muscles is probably the best way to describe this. These are muscles that twitch very rapidly, and they have a mass of these muscles in their body. And because they're twitching very rapidly, they burn through a lot of energy and therefore maintain a high internal body temperature. They're not using their metabolism in the way that we do it and the way that birds do it, but they are nonetheless generating a higher than environmental internal body temperature through the activity of these fast twitch muscles. So that may actually be a mechanism that the dinosaurs used. And we do know, for instance, that dinosaurs were known to overwinter in Antarctica. Antarctica was not the ice and snow-covered continent that it is today, because when it was connected to Australia and South America, the ocean currents could not flow around Antarctica in an endless loop and keep it very, very cool. So it was actually quite temperate, although it did suffer from a 24-hour night period because it was far enough south to experience that in winter. And so it would get cool, but it appears that dinosaurs had developed methodologies to allow themselves to overwinter in Antarctica, even under those conditions. So there's a lot of interesting things that we have to now accept as possibilities, simply because we now recognize birds as being part of the dinosaur family and being true dinosaurs in every sense of the word. We'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. So here you can actually see some chameleons. These are baby chameleons hatching from the eggs, and you can see that the eggs are not rigid and hard like the eggshells of a bird. That's because these are reptiles, and the shelled eggs, the shell material is more leathery than it is a rigid calcium carbonate reinforced material. When we look for the earliest evidence of reptiles, we look to fossils dating from around 310 million years ago and a group of reptiles called the parareptiles. These may or may not be extinct. And the reason why I say that is because if you go back and take a look at the phylogenetic tree and look at the line that connects turtles to the rest of the diapsid branch, you'll notice that there's a dotted line there. And the reason why is because it's unclear as to exactly where turtles belong in the phylogeny of modern day reptiles. If they are in fact parareptiles, which some people have suggested, then parareptiles are not extinct because the turtles are still extant. However, if turtles are not parareptiles and represent a separate branch, distinctly different from the remainder of modern day reptiles, but are certainly not parareptiles, then it is quite clear that the parareptiles are fully extinct, and the only lineages of reptiles that are extant today are the two main lineages that evolved from a common diapsid ancestor known as the lepidosaurs and the archosaurs. So the lepidosaurs are the modern day reptiles. They include the snakes and lizards. The archosaurs include the vast majority of the extinct reptiles, including the dinosaurs, the tyrannosaurs, the plesiosaurs, and so forth, but also include the birds. So we can't say that the archosaurs are extinct because birds are still with us. So there is one line of archosaurs that is still extinct. No, still extant. So this just reinforces again the idea that I was proposing earlier, that we have to rethink our complete ideas of what dinosaurs were like. The traditional dinosaur, if we'd been talking about dinosaurs 30, 40 years ago, we would have been saying that these were slow moving, not terribly intelligent animals that in some cases might have had to spend time in the water because they were so large that their skeleton could not support them against the force of gravity. These were all ideas that were traditionally associated with dinosaurs. Today, we know that that is not the case. The dinosaurs were quite active. As I said, some of them might very well have been endothermic, maintaining a high body temperature using their metabolism or some other mechanism to maintain a high body temperature. Certainly, given that all birds are endothermic, this is something that we have to point to. When we do that bracketing in a phylogenetic tree of dinosaurs and crocodilians, the two most closely related modern day reptiles to the dinosaurs, we have to acknowledge that all of those features that we associate with birds must also be features that we have to associate with dinosaurs because of the close relationship between birds and dinosaurs. So it's forced us to completely rethink what the traditional idea of a dinosaur actually is or should be. And we've talked a little bit at length about the features of dinosaurs in a previous presentation, so I'm not going to talk more at length because we've still got quite a long ways to go in this presentation. So looking at the modern day reptiles, we have the turtles, and again, as I said, the actual relationship of turtles to the rest of the extant reptiles is somewhat uncertain. They may be parareptiles, they may not be parareptiles. People have not reached a definitive decision on that. But what does make them unique is the fact that they have a shell that provides an armor plating both dorsally and ventrally, and it is formed by a separate layer of material that then fuses to the how am I going to define this? The axial skeleton. So the spinal column, the ribs, the pelvic girdle and the pectoral girdle, so the collarbones and shoulder bones, that's the clavicles, by the way, and the ribs and the pelvis, all of these are anchor points for the shells. So the shells themselves are not actually created out of those bones. Those bones are separate, but the shells are fused to that and provide a protective covering for the turtles and tortoises. What is the difference between a turtle and a tortoise, you may ask? That's a really good question because no one's really been able to definitively state that. Most turtles are aquatic, either marine or freshwater, but then some tortoises are also aquatic. And you might then argue, so the vast majority of tortoises are terrestrial, but there are several turtles that are semi-terrestrial. But as a general rule of thumb, the vast majority of turtles are aquatic and either spend most of their life in the water or part of their life in the water, whereas tortoises traditionally spend most of their life on land, although some of them do live in water. So if you go for a kayak trip or something, or a hike along Florida streams and rivers, you are likely to see box tortoises sunning themselves on logs that are in the streams. If you disturb them, they'll dive into the water. So again, not all turtles are strictly aquatic. Some turtles will actually quite happily migrate across land. Not all tortoises are strictly terrestrial. Some of them do spend a significant amount of time in water. So here is a classic turtle, and you can see that this is one that would probably spend a significant amount of time on land, judging by the shape of the feet. These are not flippers, these are walking legs. So here's a turtle that actually is more terrestrial than aquatic, although I believe the species does actually return to water and spends a significant amount of time in the water, nonetheless. The lepidosaurs are represented predominantly by snakes and lizards, but there is one lineage of lepidosaurs which you are unlikely to have seen except in a picture. This is the tuatara. There are two species of tuatara. They are native to New Zealand. And in fact, they are considered to be functionally extinct on the main two islands of New Zealand due to mammals that have come to New Zealand with predominantly European settlers, because the tuataras evolved in the absence of placental predators. When placental predators like cats, pigs and the like arrived in New Zealand, the tuataras had no way of protecting their nests against these predatory mammals, and so their nests were raided and they were pushed to extinction on the mainland. Fortunately, populations of the tuatara survive on some of the offshore islands, but the only way that these populations have been able to survive is because conservationists have gone to those islands and killed off all potential mammalian predators, goats, feral cats and the like. All of those have been executed either by shooting or by poisoning to create predator-free environments for the tuataras to survive in. If you look at this tuatara and you think that looks very dinosaur-like, looks very primitive, Hollywood thought the same thing too. And so if you go back and look at some of the B-grade science fiction movies of the 1920s and the 1930s, and you see a dinosaur about to attack humans, from one of the earliest versions of Journey to the Center of the Earth, Jules Verne's novel, the first film version of that novel featured a tuatara as a stand-in for a dinosaur, because it looks very dinosaur-like. It looks very primitive in terms of the lizards. Then the vast majority of lepidosaurs are represented by the squamates. These are the snakes and the lizards. They used to be given two separate clades, but now we recognize that snakes are descended from a common ancestor with lizards. You may be aware of the fact that there are a group of lizards called legless lizards that look very snake-like. However, you can tell the difference between a snake and a lizard in that lizards have an external opening to their ears, snakes do not. So if you see a snake-like creature on the ground and you're concerned whether it might be a snake or a lizard, and you can get close enough or you're willing to get close enough, if you see an external opening behind the eye, then it's a lizard, because that's the opening to the ear canal. Snakes don't possess that, lizards do. So that's one way that you can tell a lizard from a snake. A true snake has basically lost the vast majority of evidence for the presence of limbs. That's basically what a snake is, a lizard that has dispensed with legs. But if you look at some of the more primitive or basal snakes, and these would be the constrictor snakes, the fanged snakes, the ones that inject venom, those are considered to be more highly evolved. The more basal snakes, or quote unquote primitive snakes, are the constricting snakes. So these are the boa constrictors, the pythons and the like. Many of those, if you look in the posterior end of the animal, have vestiges of the legs in the form of tiny bones. They are disconnected from the spinal cord. There is no evidence of a pelvis, but the vestigial bones are there. And in the case of several species of snakes, there are even little skin flaps that are vestiges of the external evidence of the limbs. So this is a desert-dwelling lizard from my home country, from Australia. This is an ant-eating lizard. It has the ability to stand extremely still over an ant line. This is the column of ants that is moving backwards and forwards from the ant nest out to food resources. It simply stands over the top of that, and the ants walk between the front legs and the hind legs, and it simply flicks its tongue out and captures ants as they walk by. And apparently the ants are not even aware of the fact that the lizard is present, and it gets a meal of ants just by simply standing still and not advertising it's present and gobbling up ants as they walk past. And then everyone's familiar with the form of a snake. Here you can see a viper, which is a fanged snake. vipers come in two different forms. They have front-fanged vipers and rear-fanged vipers. Obviously, the front-fanged vipers are more likely to envenomate you because their fangs are right at the front of their mouth. The rear-fanged vipers are less likely to envenomate you because the fangs are so far back in the mouth, but they are still nonetheless effective. What adds to the ability of a snake to act, and particularly the vipers, to act as a very efficient predator. And let me fire up the pen here. Is a pair of organs that sit at the front, at the front of the head. They look like pits, hence the name. These vipers are sometimes referred to as pit vipers. These are infrared sensitive sensory organs. And these pits are very, very effective. So for instance, if you watch a rattlesnake, which is a member of the pit viper family, after it envenomates its prey, it doesn't immediately rush over to capture the prey. It strikes, envenomates its prey, and then it pulls back. Now, if it's a rat or a mouse or something like that, which rattlesnakes really specialize in tracking down, it will probably run away because of the shock of being bitten by the snake. The snake doesn't panic because the rodent leaves behind a heat trail that the snake is perfectly able to detect with these pits. And it leisurely follows the heat trail, allowing the venom to do its thing and kill the prey. And then it can crawl up or glide up and open its mouth. And you may also be aware that snakes are able to dislocate or disengage their jaw joint. It's still held together by ligaments, but they can disengage the jaw joint, which allows them to open their mouth up to ingest objects that are significantly larger than their head. And so they orientate the mouse or the rat with the head facing into the mouth, and then they slowly but surely use their fangs and their teeth to, I guess, insert is probably the best way to describe it, the prey into their mouth and on into their digestive tract. And the advantage of being an ectotherm comes into play here because they don't need to feed very often, because they don't need to generate a high level of metabolic energy in order to maintain a high body temperature. They can warm themselves up by lying in the sun. And so they can slowly metabolize their prey and get the energy that they need to maintain their body and just warm it up for activity by lying in the sun. And so they don't need to be terribly successful in terms of trapping prey in order to maintain themselves, I guess. There are a number of obvious advantages to being an ectotherm rather than an endotherm. If you're an endotherm, you are committed to eating and eating large quantities of material in order to maintain that internal body temperature. It does come as a price. Alligators and crocodiles cohabited the planet with the dinosaurs. So the late Triassic is where we see first evidence of crocodilians in the fossil record. This is the time period where we see dinosaurs emerging as well. So dinosaurs don't really appear in the fossil record until the mid to late Triassic, and we see the crocodilians appearing around the same time or a little bit later. Some fossilized crocodilians were truly giants that likely could have competed with some of the dinosaurs of their time. So there is a fossilized crocodilian that goes by the name of Supercroc. This is a crocodile that was over 50 feet in length. The fossil was found in the Saharan desert. If you want to get a feel for just how big it is, the average crocodilian today, so a Florida alligator or maybe a large saltwater crocodile, might be at a stretch somewhere around 20 to 25 feet. So basically half the length of Supercroc. It was a pretty impressive predator under the circumstances. So if you're interested in seeing just how impressive the crocodilians can be, that would be a good way to see them. There are a number of species of crocodilians extant today. Most of them are threatened with extinction due to loss of habitat and overhunting in some cases. Alligators in Florida are not threatened with extinction because they are protected. Saltwater crocodiles in Australia were once threatened with extinction, but they have been protected for about the last 40 years or so, and now they are back with a vengeance, and they are quite dangerous animals. So the sorts of crocodilians that are available, so as far as crocodiles is concerned, we have saltwater, which is a misnomer, by the way. They're not strictly limited to saltwater. They will swim backwards and forwards between saltwater and freshwater. They do, however, have a very high tolerance of saltwater. In fact, in Southeast Asia, where they are native, saltwater crocodiles have been found swimming in the ocean 450 miles away from the nearest landmass. They are only too happy to migrate long distances in saltwater. So these are found in Southeast Asia and Australia. You have what's called the Johnson's freshwater, and it is truly a freshwater crocodile, and it's found in Australia, in the rivers of northern Australia. You have the Nile crocodile, and that's in Africa. You have the American crocodile, which is found in Central America, South America, and Florida. There is a population of American crocodiles that live on the tip of the Florida Peninsula in the Everglades National Park. And so when you go down to the Everglades, you have to be a little bit careful because what you may be looking at is not an alligator, but a crocodile. How do you know the difference? When you look at a crocodile with its mouth closed, you could see some of the teeth. With an alligator, all the teeth are enclosed within the mouth when the mouth is closed. That's the difference. And then we have the Orinoco crocodile, and that's found in South America. Then for alligators, you have the American alligator, which is so that's the one that we have here. You have the caiman, which is found in South America. Oh, I forgot another crocodile. There's the Yangtze crocodile. Which is in China, but it is very, very highly threatened. And then you have the Garaval, which is found in India and Pakistan. So you can see that there's a wide range of crocodilians found around the world, different species in different locations. They're a very diverse group of animals. So here is our alligator. This is the one that you'll see here in Florida. And again, you notice that all the teeth are enclosed within the mouth when the mouth is closed. If this was a crocodile, you would be able to see several of the teeth extending out from the upper jaw and overlapping with the outside of the lower jaw. Then we have birds, which are archosaurs. That means they are related to the dinosaurs, because all the dinosaurs come from the archosaur lineage, not the lepidosaur lineage. What is unique about birds is that they have taken a basic reptilian form, a bipedal reptilian form, and highly modified it for the purpose of flight. And many of the adaptations you are likely familiar with, so the presence of feathers, again, made out of keratin. And here we need to just recognize that the main difference between scales, feathers, and hair is the way in which the keratin is secreted from the keratin secreting glands in the skin. They are all very, very closely related. It's really all about the genetics of the glands that are producing the keratin and the way that keratin is secreted as to what type of structure you're going to get, whether you're going to get scales as you do in reptiles, or feathers as you do in birds, or hair as you do in mammals. So a feather is actually a very highly modified reptile scale. Other things that are associated with adaptation to flight, you can see here, no urinary bladder. So when a bird poops, the fecal matter also contains the very highly concentrated urine. It is so concentrated that it basically forms a white layer around the fecal matter when the bird defecates, because it doesn't have a urinary bladder to hold the material. Too much weight. The females only have a single ovary because that's all you need to provide the eggs. Two ovaries is a luxury. So as you only need one, again, weight loss. And of course, loss of the jaw and no teeth, the development of the beak, is also an adaptation to flight. Interestingly enough, early in the development of a chick embryo, the teeth buds actually appear in a structure that would, if this was to develop into a jaw with teeth, develop along that way, but it very quickly gets reabsorbed and you get the production of the beak. But there are mutations that actually retain the presence of these teeth buds in the developing embryos. Likewise, if you look at a bird's tail, there are no bony extensions of the spinal cord to form the tail. It's all formed out of elongated feathers. But again, there is a mutation that is found in chickens and in other birds that leads to the production of a few extra vertebrae post-pelvis. A indication that the genes for things like a jaw with teeth or a bony tail still exist, they are just turned off. But those genes, the genetic heritage, the genetic ancestry of birds as derived from a common ancestor with their dinosaur cousins still remains. And in fact, there are a number of people who are of the opinion that if we could just figure out how to manipulate the genetic switches for some of these genes, we might actually be able to reproduce a dinosaur, because remember again, birds are dinosaurs. They just have some of the switches that the more traditional dinosaurs had turned off, and that leads to a bird. What other adaptations might we include in here? Well, hollow bones. A highly efficient cardiovascular system. And one that often gets lost in the discussion of birds, repositioning there it is. I'd forgotten the word sternum for a moment. So if you take a look at the breast muscles of a bird, they are the same muscles that you and I have that are much smaller. And in fact, some of those muscles that form the large breast muscle mass of a bird, we have more out on our arms. This is one of the reasons why when people were trying to develop a way of flying, they could never develop a way of flying by creating artificial wings and flapping those. We simply do not have either the muscle strength, the muscle endurance, or the positioning of the muscles to be able to do that. Birds have repositioned much of their muscle mass that's involved in flapping the wings to the chest. They've enlarged the sternum, the breastbone, to allow for an enlarged muscle insertion. And this provides the energy to flap the wings for extended periods of time, something that we as humans could never do. So we will never be able to fly by flapping. Our body, our physiology, our morphology, our anatomy simply does not allow for it. In birds, a adaptation, a reallocation of resources, a repositioning of features, an adaptation of features, a repurposing of features has modified the basic reptilian body plan to allow a bird to fly. So you can see some of the other features here. You can see the hollow bones. This they actually get from their dinosaur ancestors, the very large herbivorous dinosaurs, the Diplodocus and so forth. They actually had hollow bones, and they used these hollows as auxiliary gas exchange cavities. Because their bodies were so large, the cardiovascular system, as efficient as it was, and dinosaurs and birds have perhaps the most efficient cardiovascular system ever to evolve. That efficient cardiovascular system, for all its efficiency, simply could not support gas exchange in a large body like the herbivorous dinosaurs. And so they developed these auxiliary gas exchange chambers by hollowing out the bones. And birds have inherited this and been able to utilize these hollow bones for the purpose of flight through adaptation. So here's some other things that we associate with birds. The freedom to move over long distances, get access to new resources. Those that are hunting birds, like birds of prey, they have very acute vision so that they can see their prey from high altitude. If you're an owl, you have modified feathers that allow you to fly silently. They're almost undetectable in terms of making sounds. You can't hear the wind passing over their wings. You can't hear the wings moving in the air at all because of the interactions between the feathers. It's a very different system. When we look at the origin of birds, they appear in the Jurassic, about 150 million years ago, from feathered dinosaurs. Most of the what are known as the Sauretian dinosaurs. So you have the two branches of dinosaurs are called the Ornithischians, or bird-like dinosaurs, and the Sauretians, which include the allosaurs and the T-Rexes, the Tyrannosaurs, also the large herbivorous dinosaurs. They're all Sauretians. Triceratops is a Sauretian. These all come out of that same lineage that give or represent the same clade from which birds would emerge. And there is evidence that many of the Sauretians had feathers in some form or another. Maybe not a complete body covering, although some of them clearly do from the fossil record, but certainly they have, it's almost certain that all of them had some form of feather arrangement, certainly for show, perhaps to indicate mating status and so forth. It's the line that gives rise to birds, the theropods, which includes the little bipedal meat-eating dinosaurs like Deinonychus, Compsognathus, the other tiny little meat-eating dinosaurs that you might have encountered through Jurassic Park and so forth. These are the line of feathered dinosaurs that gave rise to the earliest of birds. Archaeopteryx, which is the earliest known feathered organism that may be a bird, because it's not entirely clear that whether it lies within the line of birds or whether it's tangential to the line of birds, was found first in Germany. The first evidence of Archaeopteryx is this fossil. These two photographs are actually from my personal collection, again taken when I was on my trip around the world in 2012. I stopped in Berlin and had the opportunity not only to see some of the very first fossils of Archaeopteryx, this is the first one, but also to take a look at this really beautiful specimen of Archaeopteryx. This is the Berlin specimen. There are 10 in total, all located in, or largely located in museums in Europe. I believe there is one specimen here in the United States now, but I'm not entirely sure, but there are 10 worldwide. A paleontologist had actually come to the museum to take a look at this fossil in detail. He was actually traveling around Europe looking at all the European fossils, which at that time, there were actually 12 all located in Europe, and he had permission to go around and, sorry, 10 in Europe, and he had permission to go around and take a look at all of them in detail. So he had this one out of the display case. And I saw him working on this in the middle of the atrium of the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And so I went over and introduced myself to him and explained what I was doing. And he said, I need to work on this for about another half hour to complete my detailed analysis, but come back in half an hour and you can take all the photos that you want. So that's how I got to look at this up close and personal without it being under layers of glass in display case. This was out in the open, and I felt really privileged to be able to do this. This is an artist's representation of Archaeopteryx, and so it has lizard-like features in that it has teeth in jaws in the mouth, so that's a lizard-like feature. It has claws on its wings, again, a lizard-like feature that you don't see on birds, and it has a bony tail with vertebrae in it, again, a lizard-like feature. But then it has all of these feathers, and specifically, what is most remarkable is this feather. And I want to draw your attention to a feature of this feather that tells you something really important. So if we take a look at this feather, here is the line of the central rib of the feather. And why this is important is because this half of the wing is much smaller than this half of the wing. This feather is asymmetric. And what is important about an asymmetric feather is that this is a flight feather. So when you see an asymmetric feather, where one side of the feather is larger than the other, you're looking at a flight feather. And Archaeopteryx clearly has asymmetric feathers on its wing and to some degree on its tail. These are flight feathers. Archaeopteryx could form a wing that allowed it to fly. Now, whether it formally flied like a bird, whether it could fly off the ground remains a little bit of a mystery. In fact, the whole evolution of flight is still something a little bit of a mystery. We have some clues from fossils that have come out of a fossil bed in China called the Liaoning fossil bed, where the perfect conditions for preserving birds existed, and some really outstanding fossils of early birds have come out of there, including a bird that had 4 wings. All 4 limbs were wings, and a documentary was actually done for PBS some years ago that looked at this fossil, and 2 competing groups tried to figure out how these 4 wings allowed the bird to fly. And it turns out that it used its 4 wings in much the same way as humans did early on, in the form of a biplane. It created a very stable way for the bird to fly. We don't know whether Archaeopteryx could actually fly in the formal sense of the word, but it could certainly use its claws on the wings and on the feet to climb up into a tree and leap into the air and glide through the forest, capturing insects, if it could not fly. There are actually 2 hypotheses that try to explain the origin of flight. One is the down from the trees. So Archaeopteryx climbing up into a tree, leaping into the air and gliding, and eventually either Archaeopteryx or descendants of Archaeopteryx or related or bird-like creatures evolved the ability to fly by flapping wings, or up from the ground, where the birds initially used the wings as a way of stabilizing themselves as they ran rapidly across the ground. Eventually, they evolved a mechanism of launching themselves into the air by flapping their wings. Those are the 2 major hypotheses that try to explain how birds evolved the ability to fly. We don't know which is correct, but those are the 2 main ways that people look at the origin of flight. In terms of living birds, what is interesting is, from the fossil record, there are 3 lineages of birds that are known. One is referred to as opposite birds because the structure of the shoulder joint is 180 degrees inverted compared to the structure of modern birds. The other lineage of birds is referred to as confuciform birds. And then we have the 3rd clade, which gave rise to all modern birds, the Neornithes. Sorry. What happened to the other 2 lineages of birds? They became extinct during the end Cretaceous extinction, along with the dinosaurs. What we think allowed the clade that gave rise to the Neornithes is that these are birds that are in the fossil record associated with water. And it may very well be that because of their association with environments in and around water, that they were able to survive the catastrophic events associated with the asteroid collision. And for this reason, they appear to be the only line of birds to have survived the end Cretaceous extinction. Out of that, we find all modern birds. While the vast majority of birds can fly, of course, there are birds that cannot fly. So you have the ratites. These are the, this is the ostrich, emu, and cassowary. Then you've got the penguins, and then you've got some species of birds that have lost the ability to fly because they are endemic to islands, and on those islands there were no predators to prey on them, so they gave up the ability to fly because, again, it's a cost-benefit analysis. If it's too expensive to maintain flight and you don't need it, then you dispense with it. So there is a rail that lives on the island of Guam called the Guam rail. It's almost extinct because, unfortunately, during World War II, a pregnant brown snake from New Guinea made its way to Guam, probably via a transport plane, and the arrival of that snake almost doomed the Guam rail to extinction. It only survived because of human intervention. And then pigeons, the most famous pigeon to lose the ability to fly is the dodo of Madagascar. It was actually a giant flightless pigeon. And because it was so tame, it had never seen humans before, and because it couldn't fly, it was preyed upon by whalers after it was first discovered, and in less than 100 years after its discovery, it was extinct because of hunting. And the dodos were so unafraid of humans that they would actually allow the humans to walk up to them and hit them over the head to kill them. And so when we use the term dumb as a dodo to describe someone who is not quite with it, it's a reference to the fact that the dodos appeared to be so out of it that humans could walk up to them and hit them over the head and kill them. Not because they were dumb, but because they had no fear of humans, because they'd never encountered humans before, and they did not know what a predator was. And unfortunately, the early whalers took advantage of that. Then when it says down here that the foot shows a considerable amount of variation, it could be as a paddle. It could be for walking. So that would be for the flightless birds. And then it could be for grasping. So all of these different types of feet develop as a consequence of changes during embryological development. So in the paddle form of the foot, the skin that connects the digits together does not break down, and so it leaves a paddle behind in much the same way as we see a paddle-like limb during our early development, but then the cells in between the digits break down and the digits emerge. It's the same sort of process here. When the skin doesn't break down, you get the paddle form of the foot. If it does break down, you get a walking foot or you get a grasping foot. And the grasping foot has a very dinosaur-like form where you have 3 toes pointing forwards and 1 toe pointing back, so it can wrap around and grip grip the perch. The walking foot looks even more dinosaur-like because it's large and it leaves a track behind that looks very much like a dinosaur footprint. But again, we do know that birds are dinosaurs, and so not surprisingly, some of the large flightless birds leave a footprint behind that looks very much like a dinosaur footprint, including the claws. So here you can see some different bird forms. Penguins, of course, still use their wings. They may be flightless, but they fly through the water. So their wings have been adapted for flight in a viscous medium rather than the very fluid medium of the air. They're now flying in a more viscous medium, the water, but nonetheless, it is a form of flying. So that brings us to the first break for this section, and I will stop the recording after I read out the concept check questions. So I'll see you on the other side of the break with the answers to these 3 questions. Describe 3 key amniote adaptations for life on dry land. Why are snakes considered to be tetrapods? And describe 4 avian adaptations for flight. I'll see you on the other side of the break.